Good afternoon, everyone. Today's argument is blunt. The most dangerous war in the Middle East is not only the one that destroys infrastructure, widens across borders, or terrifies governments. It is the one that strikes at the financial foundation of American power itself. The one that does not merely shake oil markets, but shakes the currency order built around them. The one that turns a regional war into a direct assault on the system that has allowed the United States to turn military influence into global financial dominance for decades. That is the scenario we are examining today. This presentation argues that if a full-scale war erupts between the United States, Israel, and Iran, one of the most dangerous long-term consequences would be pressure on the petrodollar system. Not because the dollar collapses in a single dramatic moment, and not because one missile suddenly rewrites global finance overnight, but because war can accelerate trends that are already moving beneath the surface. It can expose dependency, it can intensify fear, it can force states to hedge, and once enough actors begin hedging at the same time, the system that once looked permanent starts looking political, fragile, and expensive to defend. That is the real danger, because the petrodollar is not just a technical arrangement. It is power, it is leverage, it is demand for American currency, it is demand for American assets, it is a financial advantage backed by military architecture, and if war begins weakening the architecture, then the advantage begins weakening with it. So let us begin with the first principle. The petrodollar is not magic. It survives because key energy producers sell oil in dollars, accumulate dollar reserves, and recycle enormous pools of capital back into American markets, institutions, and financial instruments. That creates a powerful loop. Oil generates dollars. Dollars flow into U.S. assets. U.S. assets reinforce American financial strength. American power then helps defend the regional order that keeps the loop alive. That is the system. And for a long time, it has looked natural because it has looked stable. But it is not natural. It is geopolitical. It is protected. It is maintained by confidence, pressure, incentives, and force. That is the first major argument of this presentation. The dollar's privileged relationship with Gulf energy is not just an economic fact. It is a strategic arrangement, and strategic arrangements can be shaken by war. Now let us move to the opening stage of the scenario. The United States and Israel launch a major strike campaign against Iran. Their goal is to impose shock, restore deterrence, and prove that military dominance still governs the region. On the surface, that seems like a defense of order. But underneath, the war creates a much more dangerous question for the Gulf states and for the wider world. If the region that anchors dollar-denominated energy trade is now unstable, how secure is the system built on top of it? That question is poisonous, because financial systems do not break only when they fail technically. They begin breaking when states decide it is too risky to rely on them politically, and war is one of the fastest ways to create political risk. That is where the scenario becomes dangerous. If Gulf states begin feeling that their wealth, infrastructure, cities, ports, and ruling systems are being exposed by a war tied to American strategy, then some of them will start thinking differently. Not necessarily publicly, not dramatically, but quietly, strategically, and over time. They will ask whether it is wise to keep so much of their future tied to a system that may now be dragging danger toward them instead of away from them. That is how hedging begins, not through speeches, through fear, through diversification, through quiet reallocation, through reserve management, through alternative payment channels, through warmer ties with non-Western partners, through a different answer to a simple question: what protects us best in the next crisis? That is the second major argument of this presentation. The petrodollar does not need to be overthrown to be weakened. It only needs to become less trusted, less exclusive, and less automatic. Now let us look at the Gulf more closely. For decades, the Gulf monarchies have benefited enormously from the existing system. They sell energy into a world priced heavily through the dollar. They build sovereign wealth in dollar assets. They park capital in American markets. They gain security from an American-led regional structure. In return, the United States gains more than alliance symbolism. It gains demand, it gains capital flows, it gains financial depth, it gains the privilege of sitting at the center of the world's energy financial loop. But here is the brutal truth at the heart of this scenario. That bargain works only as long as the Gulf believes the arrangement is worth the risk. War changes the risk. If Gulf rulers begin concluding that alignment with Washington makes them more exposed to missile pressure, infrastructure disruption, market instability, and domestic anxiety, then even governments that remain formally aligned may start pursuing financial insurance elsewhere. not because they want to destroy the dollar tomorrow, but because they want options the next time Washington's wars start threatening their survival. That is how systems erode, not all at once, in layers. A little less exclusivity here, a little more local currency trade there, a little more gold accumulation, a little more reserve diversification, a few more bilateral payment systems, a few more energy deals structured outside traditional channels, a few more strategic openings to China, India, or other large buyers willing to operate differently, and each step by itself looks manageable. Together, they begin changing the architecture. Now let us bring in Iran's side of the equation. Iran cannot defeat the United States in a conventional war of scale. But in this scenario, Iran does not have to. It only has to widen the cost of America's regional strategy until the states that support the system begin doubting the system itself. That means threatening the Gulf, stressing energy routes, exposing allied vulnerability, and making the whole arrangement look more unstable than Washington can easily admit. This is asymmetry at the monetary level. A weaker power does not destroy the reserve currency directly. It pressures the geopolitical ecosystem that helps sustain the reserve currency's privilege. That is a much sharper strategy than many people realize, because the dollar does not float above politics. It is embedded in politics, embedded in alliance structures, embedded in energy systems, embedded in security guarantees, embedded in the perception that the American order, whatever its flaws, is still less dangerous than the alternatives. If war begins changing that perception, the dollar's advantage does not vanish overnight, but it starts costing more to preserve. That is the third major argument of this presentation. Once monetary privilege requires more visible coercion, more expensive military management, and more nervous allied compliance, it stops looking like effortless dominance and starts looking like a system under strain. Now let us widen the frame. The world is already more multipolar than it used to be. That does not mean the dollar is finished. It does mean the environment is less forgiving. Large powers are exploring alternatives. Major energy buyers want flexibility. Rival financial infrastructures, though weaker, are becoming more politically attractive to states that fear overdependence on the American system. In a calm world, many governments tolerate that dependence. In a world of regional war and strategic coercion, tolerance weakens. That is what makes this scenario so dangerous. Because war does not create every trend from scratch, it accelerates trends already waiting for pressure. This is exactly the kind of pressure that turns discussion into policy. It turns theoretical diversification into practical diversification. It turns polite diplomatic balancing into financial hedging. It turns quiet dissatisfaction into structural drift. And structural drift is deadly for systems that depend on being central by default. Now let us talk about capital flows, because this is where the scenario becomes especially painful for the United States. If Gulf states begin investing more cautiously in American assets, or if war forces them to prioritize defense spending, domestic continuity, and infrastructure resilience over external asset accumulation, that has consequences. The old recycling loop weakens. Capital that once flowed smoothly into U.S. equities, bonds, and strategic sectors becomes less reliable. Some of it may still go there, but not with the same confidence, scale, or exclusivity that matters. Because American financial strength is not just about productivity or innovation, it is also about absorption. The ability to absorb global capital because the system is trusted, deep, liquid, and politically central. But if the politics of the system become more threatening, more unstable, or more visibly militarized, then some portion of that capital begins looking for distance. And distance is dangerous to empires built on centrality. Now let us examine the psychological side, because financial order depends heavily on habit. People act as if the dollar-based order is eternal because they are used to it. They price around it, plan around it, trade through it, save through it, hedge through it. But habit weakens when fear enters the room. And nothing invites fear like a war in the zone, most associated with dollar-based energy power. That is when uncomfortable questions start multiplying. What if Washington can still punish but not stabilize? What if Gulf allies still cooperate but less enthusiastically? What if more oil starts being sold through mixed currency channels? What if reserve strategies become more defensive? What if alternative systems do not replace the dollar completely but reduce its automatic dominance? Those questions are enough to change behavior. And once behavior changes, systems that once looked permanent begin looking conditional. Now let us bring in China and other major actors, because this is where the long-term strategic contest sharpens. China does not need a dramatic anti-dollar crusade to benefit from this scenario. It only needs time, opportunity, and nervous partners. If Gulf producers and large Asian consumers both want more room to maneuver, then Beijing gains space to offer alternative settlement paths, stronger bilateral frameworks, and a different political promise. Less ideological pressure, less direct security dependence, and more transactional flexibility. That offer will not replace the American system overnight, but it does not have to. It only has to become more attractive to more actors in more transactions. That is how erosion works, not through a single event, but through a growing number of exceptions to the old rule, and every exception chips away at the old certainty. Now let us examine the American response. Washington, in this scenario, will insist the system is strong. It will reassure markets. It will reaffirm alliances. It will increase military deployments. It will try to prove that the old order can still be defended. But that response contains the trap, because the more visibly the United States must use force to reassure everyone that the system is stable, the more the world sees that the system is not standing on consent alone. It is standing on escalation, exposure, and cost. That is not a flattering image for a reserve order. And it gets worse if the war drags on. The longer the conflict lasts, the more the Gulf questions its exposure. The more the Gulf questions its exposure, the more it hedges. The more it hedges, the more the United States has to reassure. The more it has to reassure, the more expensive the system becomes. The more expensive it becomes, the more the world starts wondering whether this is strength or overextension wearing a confident face. That is the cycle. Now let us move to the final stage of the scenario. The war does not kill the petrodollar in one dramatic collapse. That is not the point. The point is more dangerous than that. It makes the petrodollar look political rather than permanent. It makes Gulf loyalty look strategic rather than automatic. It makes dollar recycling look conditional rather than natural. It makes alternative channels look prudent rather than radical. And once all of that happens, the system enters a different era, an era where the dollar may still dominate, but must dominate under more visible strain. An era where alliances matter more because confidence matters less. An era where every new conflict in the Gulf carries a financial penalty larger than before. An era where the privilege of centrality no longer feels cost-free. That is the final lesson of this presentation. Great monetary systems rarely die in one dramatic explosion. They weaken through politicization, overuse, coercion, and strategic fatigue. This scenario is dangerous because it attacks exactly those weak points. So what is the conclusion? It is this. The war that breaks the petrodollar is not necessarily the war that destroys the dollar outright. It is the war that exposes the military and political scaffolding holding the system together. It is the war that pushes Gulf states to hedge, rivals to innovate, and global actors to diversify. It is the war that reveals that financial dominance is not just about markets, it is about the credibility of the order behind them. And once that order starts looking riskier, more coercive, and more unstable, even a dominant currency begins losing the effortless authority that made it so powerful in the first place. That is the nightmare. A war where oil becomes a weapon against the currency order built around it. A war where allied fear turns into financial hedging. A war where reserve privilege becomes harder to maintain. A war where the United States discovers that military escalation can protect a system in the short term while weakening trust in it over the long term. A war where the battlefield is in the Gulf, but the deeper struggle is over who gets to define the financial language of power in the century ahead. And once that struggle begins, it does not end when the missiles stop. Thank you.